I know there's a lot of talk about cinematographers having a certain style, and certainly a lot of my peers do have very individual style. But historically, I think there are few cinematographers that we think of as having an ingrained style. Most of the studio cinematographers during the 30s, 40s, and 50s were actually under contract to the studios. People like Arthur C. Miller was almost his entire career. He worked for 20th Century Fox, Leon Shamroy at Fox, and certainly Harold Rosson at MGM. Most of his career was at MGM, starting with Metro in the silent years. He represented more of a studio style. And each of the studios, more than individual cinematographers, had a style. There was that kind of gritty, sort of almost street documentary look that we associate with the Warner Brothers crime dramas of the 30s that were harbingers of the noir style of the 40s. There was the really glossy, creamy look of Paramount that we associate with, from Sternberg. We think of the MGM studio style so much in terms of a very broad kind of full lighting style that we associate particularly with the MGM musicals. And it's often been disparaged by other cinematographers as museum lighting, just kind of flat ambient lighting that had very little emotion to it. Harold Rosson is very often identified with that style, which is one reason I think why he's kind of stayed slightly below the surface in terms of recognition when we think of a lot of the signature cinematographers. But in fact, Rosson had a remarkable kind of range of work.
Where do you guys think you're going?
Harold Rosson certainly was enormously experienced. He was one of MGM's top-rated cinematographers. Paul Byrne brought Jean Harlow to MGM. Rosson photographed some of her early films like Red-Headed Woman and Red Dust. Rosson photographed I think 6 of Harlow's films, and she was the big star at MGM at the time, so it's indicative of how highly regarded he was. But Rosson also, some of his earlier work before that, in the late silent era, he did a film with Sternberg called Docks of New York, which is a very dark and brooding film, not unlike John Ford's The Informer. Rosson then went on in the late 30s to photograph a number of 3-strip Technicolor films in a very different style. The most notable, of course, was The Wizard of Oz. But even before The Wizard of Oz, he had photographed 3-strip Technicolor. He did this wonderful film called The Garden of Allah. It was, I think, the 4th film to be photographed in 3-strip Technicolor in 1936. It's the film that he received his Academy Award for. Directors were assigned the cinematographers during the height of the studio era. It's not like today, or what we think of certainly in the auteur and post-auteur area, where essentially the director hires the cinematographer and they have an ongoing working relationship. If you look at the career of most of what we think of as the great American directors, during the course of their career, they maybe worked with 6, 8, or 10 different cinematographers. I mean, look at John Ford. He worked with Burt Glennon, he worked with Greg Toland. I think one of the relationships that was a very good relationship was Rosson's relationship with John Huston. There was very little to suggest that Rosson might have been the person to do a kind of dark, brooding film noir. It has a style very different than what we think of as most of Rosson's work. John Huston's first film as director was The Maltese Falcon, which is sometimes cited as a kind of proto-film noir. There are, some dramatic lighting scenes in it. He was kind of tempered, like a lot of the great American directors, by the Second World War. Huston made 2 documentaries that are 2 of the best documentaries of the Second World War. The first one's Battle of San Pietro, about the Italian campaign. And a lot of it was recreated after the fact. It's shot in a kind of newsreel documentary handheld style. The other one, and more apropos, I think, to what the arc of Huston's directorial career after the war is the documentary Let There Be Light, which was the film that he made interviewing battle-scarred PTSD veterans and the soldiers recounting the trauma of their experience. I think that sort of documentary intensity and that raw emotion not only struck Huston's soul, but played into this sort of larger sense of fatalism that we see in his work as a writer and we later see in other films. You know, when we think of documentary style, particularly in our era of small handheld digital cameras, it's very different than what was defined as documentary during the war. Classical documentary filmmaking in the Flaherty tradition or the John Grierson tradition, and certainly with Huston in Let There Be Light, is a more psychological, introspective look at the characters and the people in the frame, not as an external recording device, but as an internalized, emotional, biographical device. It's certainly there in the Asphalt Jungle. There's a single shot, a close single, of Sterling Hayden, where he's talking about his parents' farm and the horses. And you really see that environment, what that place means to him. It is actually quite reminiscent of the long take interviews in Let There Be Light, where there are rambling sequences of some of these soldiers talking not just about the trauma of their war, but about their childhood experiences. And there's something that is almost like a psychological interview of this monologue that Dix has at this time.
And then everything happened at once. My old man died, and we lost our corn crop. That black colt I was telling you about, he broke his leg and had to be shot. That was a rotten year.
So in a way, the Asphalt Jungle, it seems to me, is a film within the genre of film noir that digs deeper than a lot of the film noir, which are very plot-driven and very visually kind of raw and stylistic. I think one of the things that is so arresting and distinctive about the Asphalt Jungle is this kind of schizophrenia in the visual style. In other words, it embodies a lot of the tics and the tropes of film noir in terms of, dramatic lighting, wide-angle lenses, low angles, the use of practicals in the shots, a lot of lamps that are not just the source, but they're actually physically in the shot, the kind of gritty urban street quality, the focus on criminal act, in this case, the jewelry heist. But there is this level of psychological rawness and vulnerability that is grafted onto the visual style. And it's embodied in the visual style in terms of the way the camera and the lighting is used. It's very present, very much in the foreground. A lot of the scenes have one actor sitting very close to camera and the other actors behind them, putting the actors into the frame in different planes and not using a lot of camera dynamics to sort of create change in the shots, but using the movement of the actors.
Get busy, Emmerich. And remember, you might have been lying here dead with your friend.
Shall I get in touch with you through copy?
No, I'll get in touch with you.
What Huston and Rosson do in Asphalt Jungles is they create a tremendous sense of visual change and visual size alterations in the shot by moving the actors. Our introduction to Doc, to Sam Jaffe, the cab pulls up in the foreground and he gets out, but we don't see him because the cab blocks part of it. The cab pulls out, he turns away. We follow him as he walks in and knocks on this door. The heavy kind of talks to him and he's asking to see Cobby.
Yeah?
I want to see Copy.
Who are you?
Just say Doc is here and would like to see him.
He needs $50,000 to sort of arrange this sort of hit that he wants to do. And he walks deep into this narrow hallway, We're on his back. He comes into a little cross light and he turns and we see him briefly. But then, and he's alone in this hallway, he walks downstage toward the camera and he walks into a really tight close-up and we see him straight on in a wide-angle lens. And it's a little bit shocking. And that's our introduction to him. And all the characters are introduced in very fascinating ways in this film that makes them very much foreground and present to us immediately. And it's the visual tension that is all the way through the film, a sense of being able to sort of get away from it and a sense of being entrapped in it in the same time. And there is the way the camera is used in terms of creating these alternating wide open shots and these claustrophobic close shots, especially small moves of the actors that bring them into very close foreground. One of the scenes I think of that has this sort of visual tension is a single shot. And I had to watch it a couple of times before I realized there were no cuts in it. It's the scene near the end of the film where Dix is wounded and he's been bleeding and in his shirt sleeve and he's trying to put on a jacket. And Dahl comes in. She's been able to buy a car for $400 to help them make the escape. Okay. And he's struggling to put this on. They start, talking about, the getaway, how they're going to get out and everything. It starts as a conventional 50-50 two-shot. It moves into a tighter two-shot, becomes an over-the-shoulder, favoring her. And then she moves very abruptly into the close foreground, right into the camera at the end. And Dix turns a little bit, but she comes into a very tight close-up that indicates sort of the momentum, the sort of intense desire she feels for them to get out of there. It's like this moment, there's one last chance for them to do it. And it's just that simple move right into the camera that accomplishes it.
You can't go without me. I won't let you. I won't tell you where the car is.
Another amazing shot, again, without any coverage. There's so much going on in the shot dramatically that you're not even aware that it's one shot. It starts with Sterling Hayden coming in and sitting in the foreground at the counter of the restaurant with Gus behind the counter. And there's a cat sitting on the counter. And in the background is a truck driver who's looking through a girly magazine. And there's this byplay between Gus and this truck driver about the cat. And Dix is just sitting there in the foreground. Eventually, there's a confrontation, and Gus kicks the guy out, and he comes back, and the camera does a little move around into a tighter two-shot of them. And it's a really wonderful scene that embodies certain qualities of noir, but you're not really aware of it as a noir scene because it seems so real. It's not highly stylized in a lot of ways. What is noir about it is the fact that it's a long take. There's a little camera move. The composition is unusual in that Sterling Hayden is profile for most of the scene, and he's in the close foreground. He's right there, and yet most of the action of the scene is taking place behind him. He seems like an accessory, but he's really not. And the camera is low with a wide-angle lens. And we see the ceiling of the restaurant, even though it's a stage set, and we see a fluorescent light. And one of the signature elements, of course, of classic noir are the use of, lamps in the shot, practical light sources that are bright and everything. We see this fluorescent light there, and it's a really strong element in the composition. It's particularly interesting because it was very unusual to see fluorescent lighting in movies at the time.
You can't owe money to a guy like him, a little loudmouth who bones you when he isn't even trying to.
I don't get you, Dix.
I just can't be in Cobby's debt and keep my self-respect.
I don't think that the Asphalt Jungle would have worked at all in color. When you were dealing with, the dramatic elements of life, especially urban drama and stories of dramatic conflict. It seems to me that color would have worked against the emotional feeling of it, and certainly against the kind of rawness of the characters. There's a kind of elemental, stripped, bare quality to the characters that I think would have been softened by color. One of the things visually I find very interesting in the film, and which is, I think, very much a part of what Rosson and Huston are deliberately trying to do in the film, which stands apart from noir. In a lot of noir films, the characters are contained within the larger landscape. You're very aware of the architecture, of the long shadows, of the light, the sense of visual entrapment. Asphalt Jungle does not feel to me to be particularly claustrophobic. And it's not just a question of the sets, it's also part of the lighting. You know, when we think of Nick Musaraka's noir films, or John Alton, and especially the films he did with Anthony Mann, shadows loom. You know, the shadows are kind of raking against walls, and there's a lot of foregrounding of architecture, and people seem lost in the space, oppressed and constricted in the space. Even in the interiors of Asphalt Jungle, I don't feel that kind of oppression. I feel a little bit of a kind of pressed claustrophobia, but you never feel that the actors are being oppressed by the sets. The only place in the movie I think where you might feel that kind of oppression is during that, 11-minute heist scene that begins, with Dix coming down that classic noir shot, night shot, silhouetted against a back wall, coming down the alley to the manhole cover, opening up and going underground. And then the whole heist sequence, which is done in a classic kind of noir style, really dark lighting with just little pools of light, the rest of it dark, kind of close wide angle lenses, a lot of detailing. So the beginning of the film is very open, empty streets with Sterling Hayden moving through these streets trying to stay out of range of this cruising police car. And then the end of the film, Gene Hagen and Sterling Hayden are driving to his parents' farm. In fact, that sequence opens with this really wide aerial shot, which is another distinguishing quality of the film. I think the reason the Asphalt Jungle has survived the way it has is because it is very different than other noir films. It's really a dramatic, character-driven film disguised as a noir genre film. Even though Harold Rosson and John Huston only did 2 films together, and they were films they did back-to-back, basically, there seems to have been a kind of collaborative synchronicity that I think you don't find very often, not just on the Asphalt Jungle, but in a film they did right after that, The Red Badge of Courage. It has a lot of the same kind of almost documentary techniques and close camera presence, wide angle lenses, and Red Badge of Courage, where the camera is very much right there, almost sort of claustrophobically in front of the actors' faces at times. When a cinematographer and a director have a really good working relationship, they kind of disappear inside each other. And I think that as gifted as Huston was as a director and as varied as he might be in his visual styles, there's something that is distinctive and so unique about the visual style of the Asphalt Jungle that it kind of stands alone in Huston's work.